This is one of the most remote places in America. The wilderness of the Cascade Mountain Range sits on the western edge of the continent, close to the Canadian border. The mountains here have forbidding names: Mount Terror, Damnation Peak, Mount Despair, echoing the tragedy of those who tried and failed to conquer this godless terrain. In the summer of 1956, Jack Kerouac, at that time a little-known American writer, came to spend 63 days as a fire watcher on Desolation Peak.
Desolation Peak is so remote. It was always the most remote fire station in the Forest Service. It's just a few miles south of the Canadian border. When Kerouac was there was no road that went anywhere near it. It was a 3-day trip by tug barge, horseback, and pickup truck from Marble Mount, which is where the ranger station is. Now you can make it in one day.
Little has changed on the top of Desolation since Kerouac was here. Fire watchers still work in the primitive cabin, using exactly the same firefighting equipment as he did.
Well, my main job here is to watch for forest fires and to detect smokes as soon as I can. And this is the same thing that Jack Kerouac would have had to do as his job here too. And in fact, this is the exact same firefinder that he used. It's the Osborne Firefinder Model 1934. I believe that Jack Kerouac went to school, actually, a little week-long fire school or something to learn how to do this.
Kerouac came to Desolation in his mid-30s. He'd been writing and travelling for most of his adult life, but the books that were to make his name had yet to find a publisher. He came here to escape, but he also came in search of a spiritual experience.
It was 8 or 9 weeks of mountain solitude. No distractions whatsoever. You could read, write, sing at the top of your lungs, meditate, and if you were lucky, have a vision. Kerouac had been, at this point, in intense Buddhist studies for 3 years, and he felt that he was primed for a spiritual breakthrough. So he was going up there with the idea of really having this sort of vision in solitude. And he wrote to a friend before he left, if I don't get a vision up on Desolation Peak, my name ain't William Blake.
But something went badly wrong on the top of Desolation Peak. What Kerouac experienced in the small cabin was not enlightenment, but a sense of loneliness and despair worse than any he'd ever known. A feeling of desolation so profound that it would change the whole course of his life and ultimately ruin him as a writer.
With all due respect, even Jesus in the wilderness and Buddha under the Bo tree only spent 40 days in their trials. So who knows what demons or devils Jack struggled with in his 63 days.
Desolation is the beginning of the end for him as a writer. And certainly what happens next, fame hits, and he never really, he loses his powers.
Within a few short months of coming down from the mountain, Kerouac became the most famous writer in America. His book, On the Road, was a publishing phenomenon. Overnight, he was called upon to be the spokesman for a generation, the king of cool, the first writer celebrity of the television age.
Jack, got a couple of square questions, but I think the answers will be interesting. How long did it take you to write On the Road?
3 weeks.
How many?
3 weeks.
3 weeks. That's amazing. How long were you on the road itself?
7 years.
7 years.
Well, a lot of people have asked me why did I write that book or any book. All the stories I wrote were true because I believed in what I saw. I was traveling west one time at the junction of the state line of Colorado, its arid western one, and the state line of poor Utah. I saw in the clouds, huge and massed above the fiery golden desert of Evenfall, the great image of God with forefinger pointed straight at me through halos and rolls and gold.
Kerouac's appearance in the Steve Allen Show should have been a moment of great success for him. It was a moment of triumph. His book had just come out to enormous acclaim and attention, but the Kerouac we see there is riven with contradiction. He's almost unable to control himself, so overcome is he with shyness and self-doubt.
He was one of the first writers to get the full media treatment to go on television. Television was really new in those days. A talk show had just been invented, and everybody sort of wanted a piece of him. I remember having a dream at that time of being at a reading with Jack, and that people literally tried to tear him apart limb from limb after the reading. There was that kind of avidity that people had.
It just sort of kicked the sides out of everything. And it was suddenly overnight, it was a whole new scene, just as when rock hit the music scene in this country, the 60s. It's very similar. In fact, it was the beginning of the same revolution.
On the face of it, Kerouac might have looked like literature's first rock and roll superstar, but beneath the confident public image, he was a bundle of insecurities. And many of his troubles had their roots back in his hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell is a former steel town built on a waterway once crossed by Kerouac's French-Canadian ancestors. This gentle backwater of the Depression era is a sleepy presence in all Kerouac's writing. For him, it would always be a place of childhood magic. Though famous as the writer who travelled, who left home, infatuated with the road out, Kerouac always remained half in love with his hometown and half obsessed with all its plain American values.
His family were devout Catholics, and that was also a very important influence upon Jack, and he remained Catholic, I think, through his life. So the whole Lowell experience, I think, had to do with the deeply conservative side of Jack. There are always two sides to Jack. There was that conservative, traditional side, and a much wilder side.
Kerouac's childhood was dominated by Catholicism. It brought out an intensity that would always disturb him. When his older brother Gerard died of rheumatic fever and became the family saint, a deep mourning began that would always haunt his brother, the writer.
I think he had tremendous guilt for surviving his older brother Gerard, and I think that was a very, very crucial event in Jack's life, and it shaped his whole relationship, his whole incredible attachment to his mother.
His mother, from the day that Gerard died, always held Gerard up to Jack as Gerard being a saint, and to try to be as good as his brother Gerard was. But I also have the impression that he never quite fulfilled the task.
Kerouac left Lowell for New York, dragging with him the heavy baggage of his mother's expectations and his own dreams of becoming a great writer. The small-town boy was swept away by the excitement of the big city.
Oh, he had told me he was a writer when we were talking, and I must say my interest picked up a little. Plus the fact that he was so damn handsome and sexy looking. And then he asked me where he lived. He said, I'll take you home. And in Brooklyn, he said, oh my God, you know. So we got on the train, Sea Beach Express, and when, as we were going over the Brooklyn Bridge, he my God, he carried over that wonderful view out there. But this guy was like hyper. He was hyper all the, and he looked out the window. He said, "Oh my God, that's a gorgeous view." And he went running up and down the subway train, and people were staring at him. And I thought he was on something. I thought he'd taken a little. He'd popped one, and when I didn't look, or behind my back. He struck me as somebody who was trying to be very hip, and really was a kind of nice, sweet guy at bottom, and rather simple.
That yearning to be cool and to be an author brought him into contact with other writers such as Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs. It was a world of strong personalities and radical fervour and drugs. He shared their fascination with America's subterranean lowlife, the night world, the dark world of street life. Although Kerouac was keen to be among the new visionaries, all of them presented a challenge to his basic simplicity. Much of his time in New York was spent trying to be somebody he was not.
He was shy, internalizing, reserved, not wanting to be the center of attention, more the observer. I think he felt bumbling and gauche in his spontaneity as a person, that he would blurt out the wrong candid thing. And when you travel in art circles, despite the fact that he had a good education, he didn't speak English until he was 5 years old. He grew up speaking a Canuck patois. He'd have dreams in which he'd be amongst society people and movie stars, Olivia de Havilland. His sister would come up to him, and he'd try and give her the brush off because she was talking in joual, this patois of French.
Kerouac felt most at home in the anonymous streets and jazz clubs of New York, where he fell under the spell of Charlie Parker's style of jazz, the sound of which served as the model for Kerouac's new way of writing. He wanted to write like Parker played, letting it all flow spontaneously.
This was what Charlie Parker said when he played. All is well. He had the feeling of early in the morning, like a hermit's joy, or like the perfect cry of some wild gang at a jam session, wail, whop. Charlie burst his lungs to reach the speed of what the speedsters wanted, and what they wanted was his eternal slow down. A great musician and a great creator of forms that ultimately find expression in mores and what have you.
Inspired, Kerouac wrote obsessively, filling piles of notebooks. These were the raw material for his masterpiece, On the Road. He documented his low-life travels through the great American West in search of kicks and new experiences.
Kerouac's real vision was a vision of America that no longer exists. It was a vision very similar to that of Thomas Wolfe, not Tom Wolfe, the parajournalist, but Thomas Wolfe, the author of Look Homeward Angel. His hero rode across the landscape, across the darkening landscape, and saw America from the windows of a train. And it was a sweeping vision of America, and Kerouac had that same vision, only in his case it was from the window of a speeding car.
So, in America, when the sun goes down, and I sit on the old broken down river pier watching the long, long skies over New Jersey, and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over to the west coast, and all that road going, and all the people dreaming in the immensity of it. In an hour, I know by now that children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry. And tonight the stars will be out, and don't you know that God is Pooh Bear?
Kerouac starts writing in the 40s at a time when the frontier was still a big part of America. Thought we're formed because we had this frontier, and the real American culture is always on the frontier and the westward expansion. And Kerouac came along and, basically said, well, anyone can reinvent the American frontier. They just take a less well-traveled road and throw themselves on the mercy of the universe that is America.
Kerouac was keen to throw himself on the universe of America, but he wasn't much of a driver, and he yearned for a partner who could take him out to America and out of himself. He found that partner in Neil Cassidy, who was the inspired man at the wheel in so many of Kerouac's trips across the continent. Neil was all low-life spontaneity and earthy wit, a perfect foil to the introspective and brooding Jack. He became the model for the Dean Moriarty character in On the Road, the book's great hero.
So in the last page of On the Road, I describe how the hero, Dean Moriarty's come to see me all the way from the West Coast just for a day or two. We've just been back and forth across the country several times in cars, and now our adventures are over. We're still great friends, but we have to go into later phases of our lives. So there he goes, Dean Moriarty, ragged in the moth-eaten overcoat he brought specially for the freezing temperatures of the East. Walking off alone, and last I saw him, he rounded the corner of 7th Avenue, eyes on the street ahead, and bent to it again. Gone.
He, of course, admired Neil's poise and lack of self-consciousness and his ability to get along with everybody as they were, and any level of society Neil was comfortable with. And so, of course, Jack admired all that as well as his brilliant mind. One of the most appealing things is that both of them were the most compassionate men I've ever run across, and they were also very macho.
And Kerouac turned writing into a muscular business. High on booze and Benzedrine, he hammered out On the Road in a 3-week flurry of spontaneous prose.
I would say in the first half of 1951, I was at my desk at Harcourt Brace, and the phone rang, and it was Jack. And he said, "Bob, I finished it." I said, "Oh, great, Jack, that's wonderful news." And he said, "I want to come over." I said, "What, right now?" He said, "Yeah, I have to see you. I have to show you. I want to, you know." I said, "Okay, come on over to the office." We were on 46th Street and Madison Avenue. He came into the office looking high, looking, drunk. And he had a roll of paper, like a paper towel to use in the kitchen, big roll of paper, under his left arm. And he was, this was a great moment for him. I understood that. He took one end of the roll, and he flung it right across my office, like a big piece of confetti, right across the desk. And I thought, hey, this is a strange manuscript. Never seen a manuscript like this. And he looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I said, "Jack, you have to cut this up. It has to be edited." And his face flushed, and he said, "There'll be no editing on this manuscript." I said, "Why not, Jack?" He said, "This manuscript has been dictated by the Holy Ghost."
On the Road wouldn't be published for another 6 years. Meanwhile, Kerouac made a living of a kind working with Neil on the railroad. Cassidy just may have been the brother Kerouac had always been in mourning for. He'd never really got over that early loss, and it had left a void at his centre, an eagerness to find a strong older brother who could show him how to live. Kerouac was trying to be a man he could never be. Neil was a homemaker, a provider, a father, and more or less of a husband. Jack began to realise that he could be none of these.
He finally began to realize he would never be able to be a husband and father, and although he talked about homes with me all the time, and Neil kept talking about how hung up he was with the idea of home, and he would explain how he had never learned to work and keep a job as Neil had, and that's why Neil could take care of this family, but he knew he couldn't. Of course, he dreamt that he would make enough money writing that he could get married and have a home and children, but little by little that became less and less likely.
In the loneliness of my life, my father dead, my brother dead, my mother far away, my sister and my wife far away. Nothing here but my own tragic hands that once were guarded by a world, a sweet attention, that now are left to guide and disappear their own way into the common dark of all our death. Sleeping in me raw bed alone and stupid, with just this one pride and consolation. My heart broke in the general despair and opened up inwards to the Lord.
Kerouac was always looking for a home, and looking for the homes he'd left behind. Perhaps the most comfortable places he found were the anonymous streets and bars and diners all over America, where he would be alone, or surrounded by loners. That was the life he came to live often enough, in towns like San Francisco, among the beaten-down characters that came to fill his books and his life. Kerouac stumbled through this world with compassion, and all the wasted beauty of it poured onto the page in giant manuscripts he carried around, and into the blues and songs he wrote on bus tickets. But nothing of his writing would make him happy. Kerouac became the most beat down of all his creations.
Kerouac was in this unbelievably painful situation in which he had written approximately 10 books between 1951 and 1957. Some of them he knew with reason were, works that the world would not willingly let die, and yet he could not get them published. And that in itself, I think, is a kind of crucifixion.
His whole life became very sort of unstable, and there's a real sort of deterioration in his psyche. He becomes a little paranoid. He becomes depressed. He writes very often about feeling bored, sad, lonely, and by around 1955, 56, he's already beginning to feel that perhaps he's written himself out.
But Kerouac went to his fire-watching job in Desolation Peak full of hope. At last, after many years in obscurity, On the Road was about to be published. He imagined his life would improve, but Kerouac's ambition was small scale. He did not expect riches.
It's touching to read in his notebook and to see with the proceeds that he expects from On the Road, he wants to buy a new refrigerator for his mother. He wants to get the bathtub fixed. He wants to possibly move her into a flat in Greenwich Village, with no concept of the huge fame and the amount of money that was going to come to him within the year.
Kerouac really went up the mountain in the hope of a spiritual experience that would re-energize his work. He had converted to Buddhism a few years previously and was convinced that solitude and meditation would bring about a great transformation in him.
He began to turn more and more toward Buddhism, but he really used Buddhism as a justification for all his hang-ups and as a way of not dealing with them. Why deal with them if we're all going to die, if everything is nothing?
This could be one of the great lonely places. The mountains here are close and imposing. They're the only things I've ever seen that manage to be peaceful and threatening at the same time. Every tree an eye, every star a word. This would be a great place to find silence, a great place to write in, a great place to go mad in. When I get to the top of Desolation Peak and everything leaves on mules and I am alone, I will come face to face with God or Tathagata and find out once and for all what is the meaning of all this existence and suffering and going to and fro in vain. But instead I come face to face with myself. No liquor, no drugs, no chance of faking it, but face to face with old, hateful Deloise me. I learned that I hate myself, because by myself, I am only myself.
He knows he's an alcoholic. He knows that he doesn't have the material psychologically to live. He feels he's betrayed his faith, betrayed his family, and he hates himself.
The desolation adventure finds me finding at the bottom of myself abysmal nothingness. Worse than that, no illusion even. My mind's in rags. When he came down from the mountain to San Francisco, Kerouac entered into the arms of a kind of savage fame. On the Road was finally published, immediately becoming the Bible of the newly formed Beat generation. Kerouac was embraced as its god, but his mind was wrecked, and because of the experience on Desolation, he found it impossible to deal with the pressures of celebrity.
I said, well, Jack, you've had a lot of fame since we were last working together. He said, it's been horrible. I said, what do you mean? He said, it's crazy. I don't have a minute to myself. He said, it's hurt me. It's hurt me very, very much. I can't write. I can't think. His fame was a horror to him.
He was so misunderstood and misrepresented, and he was just so sensitive that he was absolutely crushed. He expected to be accepted as a serious literary figure. And then as it went on, and he got the credit for the Beat generation and then the father of the hippies, he just was tortured.
They force you into an incredible position in the world when you want to protest or you want to make your voice known in a benevolent way, and yet at the same time you're pushed and clubbed, you know, and
You make yourself famous by protest.
that's not, who does? Not
You.
me. No, why? Make myself famous by singing Smud.
I made myself famous by writing songs and lyrics about the beauty of the things that I did and the ugliness too.
You're a
But
great
you make
poet, I
yourself
will
famous
admit.
by saying, down with this, down with that,
No.
throw eggs at this, throw eggs at that.
I
Take
hope
it
not.
with you.
That's not what I want.
I cannot use your abuse, you may have it back.
Okay, you're a great poet, and we admire you. In fact, it's your fault that we're...
It was the final insult to Kerouac's sensitivity, king of the beats. He was mistaken for a counterculture hero he never wanted to be. He thought he was celebrating the energy of a neglected part of America, but he was accused of encouraging vice and anti-Americanism. In fact, he was an old-fashioned patriot with genuine belief in the goodness of the human spirit. He just meant to wander in the streets and to sing generously of what he saw there. He was no politician. And towards the end of his life, he left the streets altogether, left the world, and went home to his mother, to drink there, and to die.
It was so hard for Neil to watch him go under with alcohol, and it just broke his heart. And for all of us, it's such a disease that you just can't help. And of course, near the end, he was just repulsive. It was too sad.
He was only 47 when he died. And yet, when you look back on it, how many novels did he publish? About 14 or 15 full-length novels. He published a book of poems. He did a film script. He did a book on Buddhism, did some nonfiction books. And it's a great body of work. So despite all the difficulties he faced, he was productive and really was truly what he wanted to be from the start, an artist. He came through as an artist.
He sensed that he would get long-term cultural vindication for what he was doing. And he wrote in his journal that someday people would be coming to Desolation Peak as pilgrims to give speeches and dedications and to pay homage to him.
The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims on the prairie, which is just before the coming of complete night that blesses the earth, darkens all the rivers, cups the peaks, and folds the final shore in. Nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. Think of Dean Moriarty, I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. Think of Dean Moriarty, I think of Dean Moriarty.